Hello, everyone. Welcome to What's Up Doc number 10. And this week we have a very interesting topic. And even as John and I were talking prior to starting the recording, I had lost one of the topics of today, which is reference points as we were talking. I needed to ground myself and figure out where we were headed, which is an interesting way to kind of lead into what is a reference point and in the context in which those reference points occur. So today, the interesting topic we will be discussing is context and reference points. And I believe last week, for What's Up Doc number 9, we had more of a preparatory introduction, put a little more work into that. And then we wanted to do more of an impromptu flow, see how we feel, step into the day type thing with context and reference points. But if we were just to take just a moment as we introduce today's topic of context and reference points. We talk about communication, use words. We know the importance of context with regards to effective communication. Half the time, effective communication is relaying your particular reference point to another individual, maintaining that reference point for a certain period of time so that a transmission and exchange of energy and information can occur as well. I know when John was describing his transformative process that occurred in 1984, that he had said he had no reference points left. They had all changed. And I remember thinking that that's a really interesting way of describing some of the processes that we go through, not just what could be called spiritual, but what's occurring today in general, where our reference points are changing. Those that used to facilitate, structure, and reflect to us the rules and how to best navigate our lives so that we'd have effective interaction with our reality in a way that would provide ease and grace and security and stability. Those are all being challenged now at this time, are they not? I know they're being challenged for me. They're being challenged on, I can speak for John that they've been challenged at least throughout his life. I can say that.
Certainly.
So we're going to open up to the topic of context and reference points. And I'm going to just hand the baton off to John and let him do a brief introduction on context and reference points for you today.
Well, I think context and reference points are important to me. And probably, if I think about why that might be true, it's probably rooted in my work life, which as a research scientist, you always had to know your reference points. If you're making a measurement, you have to know a reference point for the measurement. You have to have standards, right? Because in science, everyone has to use the same reference points, the same fundamental reference points. And those reference points can change according to what you're doing. But if I'm measuring sunlight, for example, I have to have a secondary standard. What's a secondary standard? Well, it's a device, a high quality device, probably the most expensive one I have to measure light. And I send that to the National Institute of Standards in Boulder, Colorado. And they calibrate it against their reference standard, which is matched to the global reference standards. Right? So periodically, every few years, I send that in, and then I calibrate all the instruments I drag around the world as I go and make measurements, and I calibrate them with this instrument that's housed in controlled environment and treated well. So it's a lot of trouble. Actually,
Yeah.
to do good measurements is a lot of trouble. To do temperature measurements, it's a lot of trouble. The best thermometers I used, they were all mercury thermometers, and they were, I mean, you could pay $500 for a mercury thermometer, and the thing would be, might be 3 feet long, and it might have gradations of 1/10 of a degree, which means that you could measure to maybe a few hundredths of a degree with this device, and you use this to calibrate. So reference points like that.
Scientifically, it makes sense,
Yeah, but it's interesting because why do we need to do it in science? And the reason we need to do it in science is that we all need to be using the same references for our fundamental measurements and our fundamental concepts. So if we're dealing with the only way we can communicate in science and do what we do, which is to validate new creations, new concepts that are created by other scientists, and we engage in validating those things. So the only way we can validate it is if we're all using the same reference points and the same standards for all the measurements that we're making.
Yeah.
And this is a troublesome part of science. If you're making measurements, this is an annoying part of science because you spend a fair share of your resources trying to maintain those reference points.
Yeah.
So in science, it's absolutely indispensable. And different science disciplines do this differently. And some disciplines have more trouble. They establish reference points that are not stable. Oh, what do I mean by that? Well, any instrument, measuring device that you build and you take out into the field and make measurements with it, those devices are going to drift, they're going to change, and their calibrations are going to change in their offsets. So you have to keep checking them. Well, if you get into a field like psychology, well, where are the reference points in psychology? You can see that it might be a little more challenging because it's not just a dead inert device that you're trying to calibrate, something you try to make as stable as possible. Now you're dealing with people.
Yeah.
And what are your reference points for this? And a lot of times the reference points become the collective. The same like in nutrition and in medicine, the collective becomes the reference points. And then you do a statistical analysis and you deal with the mean and the median and the variance and the kurtosis and skewness and all of these statistical properties of the collective. And the collective evolves and it changes. This is especially noticeable in nutrition, for example. They deal with the mean and the standard deviation or two of that mean and use that as a reference point. So if you're below the mean, maybe you need to supplement. If you're above the mean, maybe you have to change what you eat. Okay. But then those things drift. Those things change over time. And so they learn about new quantities in your physiology and in how your body functions. Then they have new standards. So this is a hard thing to do. So how does it apply to everyday conversations?
Yeah.
Well, it applies for the same reason. If we're going to communicate and use words, we have to be using them the same way. If we're not using the words the same way, we aren't communicating, right?
Yeah.
And one of the ways that we tend to do this is we all get educated in an education system that has standard ways of dealing with the reference points, right? Every third grade class, they all use the same books. Everyone in the particular school will use the same dictionary. Different dictionaries can give you different definitions. Online now, you can get a dozen dictionaries, and then you can get definitions all over the place for some words. You get pretty confused.
Yeah.
So it isn't so much that there's a right and a wrong reference point. I don't think of it that way at all. A reference point is just some standard that everybody accepts as a standard.
Yeah.
Right. And so it isn't, you can have some references that are more stable than other references. I mean, and so if it's stability is part of your desire here, then you have to choose the references carefully. But what they are doesn't really matter so long as they meet the criteria for a reference point. I mean, and in conversation, we all need to have similar reference points during our conversation to communicate clearly with each other. And in communication, we tend to call this context, right? So that the context of our conversation, if we're two friends, that's a different context for that communication than if we're meeting someone for the first time and we've never met them before, and we want to establish a relationship. There's a different context for that relationship. If a father's talking to his son, it's completely different than if a brother is talking to a brother. Or if a brother is talking to a sister, the context is different. I mean, so the context is changing all over the place, and it doesn't really matter too much what it is, just like a reference point.
Yes.
But what does matter is that both of the people communicating have the same one.
And that's when you're working with people too, at least on my end, I know that definitions for words are really critical to make progress in communication, especially if you're there to partner up and assist, or as a coach, client relationship, or a friend, or whatever that may be. And I make this example many times is, they were sitting around a campfire, and it was like a social gathering, and two people were starting to argue about something. I went and asked them what their definition of that word was. And they've had a different definition for that word. And then after they realized they had different definitions, they were able to find mutual ground a lot easier. And I see and I sense and I feel that a shift in context is quite prevalent through communication.
Yes. Yeah.
Reference points and context going together, you can have and I think this is the best way to describe it, as an internalized context and reference point that you're coming from. And you're communicating from that internalized context and reference point based on your experience in your life and everything you've had in your whole lifetime. But you're communicating that to another person, assuming theirs is the same.
Yeah.
It's not.
It's not. Never is.
Never is. So, but we're assuming that person, because your internal state, and this is based on my own experience, I can't really project this on someone else, but you have your context, your reference point, you're coming from this situation, you put it out there, and you wonder why it falls flat. You wonder why the person doesn't understand how significant the aha moment was, or where you're coming from. They have their own thermostat. We talked about a thermometer. They have their own thermostat, the internal gauge. And so what is this? Is a dance of exchange of energy of two different source points. So you have one source point, a context and a reference point coming out, another source point coming in, another context reference point coming out, and they interact. And if they're resonant, there's an exchange, right? But if they're not, there's this disjointedness. There's this, and that is knowledge, context, and reference point. That's frequency, that's energy exchange. And looking back on science and the standardized tests and the standardization of it was very efficient and reproducing and communicating and understanding what that is. That's what peer-reviewed articles are all about, as reference points and context, and being able to reproduce the research so that you can compare and contrast, and the validity of a particular experimental design and finding and summarization of those findings, that can be replicated by another independent group, although that's not as nearly as likely as we would like. But that gives us insight into context and reference points from a perspective of science as an individual level, from our language and our communication, from friends to fathers to the different relationships we have. And then we all the way up to the metaphysical and the quote unquote spiritual. If I were to ask someone else what love is, they're going to may have a different answer than the one you would have, John. The very dynamic instrumental physics term of interaction. What is that definition of love again, John?
Oh,
I ask you that.
It's like a reversal transference.
Reversal transference, yeah.
A point of function.
Point of function.
Two complementary forces.
Where two complementary forces.
In the presence of a third stabilizing factor.
In the presence of a third stabilizing factor.
Exchange modes.
Exchange modes.
And one becomes the other.
And one becomes the other.
This is how a conversation works if you think about it, because the third stabilizing factor there is the context. Right? Or it's the reference point. And if you don't have a reference point, right, then it's not going to work. You aren't going to have what I say. If you and I don't have a similar context, they're probably never exactly the same, but a similar context, then what I say is not what you hear.
You hear your own thing.
I used to have a sign up on my wall. I don't know if I can remember this again. It was one of these things that you had to read 10 times to actually figure out what it said. But it was something like, I know you think you perceive what you, I know you believe you perceive what you think I said, but I'm not sure that you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. Right?
That summarizes it really well, what I was trying to describe earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, I had that up on my wall for years and years and years, for 20 years. I had that up on my wall in my office at the university. It was really true. If you contemplated it for a bit, you realize the statement was actually valuable. It's just that it wasn't the kind of statement you could just read quick and understand it. You really had to break it down into the phrases and clauses and think about each one and what it meant. So it really is absolutely critical. And it's interesting to look at different conversations and then see how difficulties with reference points and context occurs in conversation with the same two people on two different subjects. Right? So if I have a real vested interest in something, I'm not very tolerant with adopting a context of someone else. Right? And so, I think I have found that I get into arguments with people when I'm not willing to adjust my context to try to find a common context between the person I'm talking to and myself.
Interesting.
And if I can't find that context, I tend not to continue the conversation too long. And a good way of experiencing this or watching it is watch a debate among political competitors, political rivals. All right, you watch the debate. What happens is the question is asked by a supposedly neutral person, and they try to be as neutral as a person can be. And the first thing that it really means that the context of the question asker is not real clear necessarily. And you might say, well, there's no context, and there is, because the words themselves convey some of the context, right? But certainly expressions and the voice and all kinds of things that the monitor on the debate. But almost always what happens is the politician answers with a different context than I perceive the question to have to begin with. In other words, I'm trying to perceive the question with the context of a neutral request, somebody who really wants to know the answer to this question.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is that the politician then very quickly shifts it to their own context, right? And answers the question in their own context. And in this case, it's pretty obvious that they're doing that. And they almost have to do that in a debating environment. But if you and I are having a discussion about some particular social issue, and I'm a progressive or a liberal and you're a conservative, we're going to come to this with different contexts. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that when two people get into an argument, it usually means that they have either a different context or different reference point for the words that they're using. And context and reference point aren't quite the same thing, but they're very closely related concepts.
Yes. And what about beliefs? How does that fit in?
What about what?
Beliefs, a belief system.
The belief system.
A belief system.
Oh, the belief system.
Yeah, belief system.
Yeah, that's part of a person's context.
So you would say
Everything.
Beliefs are a part of the context. And
oh yeah.
Yeah.
I think they are. I don't think that often if a person is not aware of the context of the conversation and whether the two people have the same context, then I think oftentimes beliefs are a very important part of the conversation depending on the topic. Right? And I think I always try to be sensitive to the context. And I always try to know what my reference points are. So if somebody stops me and says, what does that word mean? I want to be able to give them an answer to that.
Yeah.
And so I think that the laissez-faire, if you're just chatting or talking and if it's somebody really familiar, context normally just happens. If it's one of your best friends, context just happens when you see each other.
Yeah.
And you have a common context. If it's somebody you don't see very often, and they have very different perspective on topics that you have, how you approach this has a big impact on the context that's going to get established. your body language,
Yeah.
your eye movements, the inflection in your voice. I mean, how you hold yourself. I mean, all these things affect the context.
So when you have a conversation, John, you're looking to be sensitive to their context. And just earlier today, when we weren't recording, I was searching for context with John by switching context up at almost every sentence, and he called me out on it. It was an interesting prequel to our conversation today, and I acknowledged that. And I was grasping for his context, where I could meet him by introducing a different perspective or a different context. He's like, what are you doing? And beliefs are really close to context. And I always describe beliefs are tricky because you associate your conditioning yourself to a certain extent. You can at times with a belief infrastructure. And if someone comes in with a contradictory belief system or contradictory input, that you actually feel personally attacked because that infrastructure, that conditioning, that lower ego itself feels that is itself being threatened. However, if you don't have an attachment to your beliefs, you hold on to them really loosely, understanding that they could change at the drop of a hat, and say, you know, this makes sense for now, but you know what? I don't identify with that belief system. I don't identify with that context. So if I don't identify with a particular context, and I'm willing to go around and meet people where they are. And I think, John, when you say you're being sensitive to context, do you meet them where you are, where they are sometimes, to be able to find a camaraderie there, to be able to find efficient communication?
It's always what I'm looking for. And if I realize very quickly that the other person's context is one that I can't assume because, well, for a lot of reasons, they might be angry, they might be resentful, they might have a residual emotion attached to a previous conversation or experience. And it's rigid. It's not flexible. Then usually those are short conversations. Because to me, if I can't match their context, I can't really communicate. We're both wasting our time if we can't match the context. And since my working assumption in conversations is that most people don't worry about the context. They just talk to people, right? They have a context, but if you ask them what it was, they would probably be puzzled. Most people, some people wouldn't be. And so I know that if I want to have this conversation with this person, I need to move toward their context, right? So I give you an example. My context for my life is unity. I mean, that's my default context, unity, which means that I take a perspective that's, above a situation, looking down at everyone and how a particular set of circumstances is affecting all of the people involved in that interaction. And so that's the default, but that isn't how most people look at it. At least the default state doesn't seem to be that, because as soon as I start to converse with someone, I can tell that, well, their context, their default context is different from that. It's, their sphere of influence or their survival requirements or, their families, right? They have a context that is identifiable, and they move it into different places depending on where they are. And different people, they fall into different default contexts.
Yeah.
So it's always a more focused context. And the most common default context I run into is myself. Okay. A person is concerned about themselves, and that's okay. I mean, but then I have to think about how I would relate when I'm considering my context to be my own survival. So what I mean, I enter into these most conversations, and I'm prepared to take on whatever context the conversation tends to take on if I really want to converse with somebody, unless we're just talking about the weather or the dust storm that's coming tomorrow or the 100-degree temperature day. It's sometimes it doesn't matter much. So I guess I'm maybe pretty aware of that, because it seems like my default context is not one that I run into many people with that default.
Yeah.
So I always have to be aware of that if I want to communicate.
Yeah, I would say you're a very giving person, very cognizant and aware, and having a default of unity for your context is kind of an advanced way to be. And when you do have a default as unity as a context, meeting people where they are is probably a very good approach. Being sensitive to their context, being able to meet them there. With regards to context, is it safe to say that in order to communicate a particular reference point, that you have to meet at a similar context?
That's a good question. I guess that relates to the relationship between context and a reference point.
Let's say if you have a reference point, like you have a reference point of unity,
Yeah.
your default. Do you need to meet someone in a similar context to
Right.
that other person has, so that you can communicate your reference point of unity?
Right.
So you have a context default of unity, you have a reference point of unity.
Yeah, and that probably depends on how the conversation goes and what the interest is of each person in having that conversation. If that person wants to learn about unity, I'll still take their context and try to describe unity to them in their context.
Yeah.
And sometimes this is not easy to do. I mean, because to move out of your self-interest and establish a reference point that's outside of that, that's not something you just decide to do and do. Okay, at least that's not the way it happened for me at all. That's a decade of appreciating the difference between how, in my case, as a scientist, how I viewed reality. And then once I wasn't doing the science anymore, I could take a holistic perspective.
Yeah.
Right? Because that became more meaningful to me than a piecemeal perspective. I see science as a piecemeal perspective, because there's a lot of disciplines and sub-disciplines and sub-sub-disciplines, and each one has its own jargon, and each one have their own reference points and their own context for their exchanges. I mean, but they don't fit together very well. A lot of them do not. They're not continuous. It's not like reality. the structure in science is far from the structure of reality, because the structure in science is discontinuous. Right?
Yeah.
And the only way you can bring any holistic perspective from a science point of view is if you make a lot of assumptions, which, it's like having two radios. You got, two. Yeah, that should work. You got two battery powered radios, and each one is small and it doesn't reach very far. So you get Scotch tape and you tape the two together, and now you see if you can get a signal from further away. Well, it's not going to work, right? It's more complicated than that. Well, that's exactly what it's like when you go between two disciplines, right? You can't just Scotch tape them together with an assumption, because the assumption is nonsense. Right? For a science context, assumptions are unprovable statements. They don't meet the standards for how you connect things together. You can connect them with an assumption, but it's not an acceptable way to do it in science. So I don't see, after I retired, looking back, I didn't see science as being a very good representation of reality, because reality is all synchronized.
Yeah.
Right? It's not only all continuously connected in space, it's also continuously connected in time. And so
Yeah.
I looked at that and I said, that's not a holistic point of view. And then I could understand after I retired why it was so frustrating and painstaking to try to work across different disciplines. I mean, I made the problems, it looked like I was just trying to make the problems harder.
Yeah.
If I was in soils and I'm dealing with the soil surface interface with a clover crop, right? The way I have to characterize that soil surface and that crop in a way that I can connect them together in a rigorous, defendable way takes years to do something that you could just do with an assumption, right?
Yeah.
And bury it in a model someplace so that anybody looking in the model is going to have a hard time finding it. They aren't going to really know what you did, because you've got thousands, tens of thousands of statements, and who's going to go work through them all?
That happens a lot, doesn't it?
It happens a lot, especially in interdisciplinary work.
Uh-huh.
And if you really want to connect those two robustly together and do the mathematics and solve the continuity equation and solve the conservation equations across that boundary, it takes years and years to do that. And when you're done, the numbers are all different than the numbers were on people who made assumptions.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter, because the people who made the assumptions are in the discipline and you're not.
Yeah.
So the fact that you're not in their discipline, you're kind of a freeloader, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right? That it doesn't change that discipline.
Yeah.
Because the people in that discipline have a disciplinary context. And if you have an interdisciplinary context, right? In other words, the phenomena you're dealing with is your context, not the discipline you work in, which means that you're being motivated by the problem itself, you're not in a discipline looking for something you can do with that discipline. So the contexts here are really different in those. And once I realized that from the science I was doing, 38 years of interdisciplinary science, well, more than that, 40 plus years of interdisciplinary science, I started to realize, the way we perceive reality is
Yeah.
more like the way science describes it.
Yeah, I
Right?
think
The
that's a
more
critical
these-
point. That's where I want to go. So we're looking at the discontinuity. You talked about how structure of science is far from the reality. Science is discontinuous and reality is continuous. And we're actually perceiving our reality as more as a scientific discontinuous perspective than a continuous. Is that what you're about to head into?
Yeah, yeah. And so this thinking about holistically, the only place I could accept that was worthy of starting somewhere with the holistic view was unity.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's a
so when you
reference
start
point.
at unity, it's a reference point. It's where it started. I mean, if you're a religious person, it's the creator, okay? And Allah and Abun and lots of names.
Yeah.
But that's unity. I mean, and that seems like that's the only reasonable place I could find to start. But once you start there, then you have to start to reflect on what's the relationship between unity and duality.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, a lot stems from this. So a lot of these issues with reference points and context are ones that I lived with for 40 or 50 years in my work life, but never really articulated them as clearly as I did after I retired.
Yeah.
That's when the articulation came into being for me, because I wasn't harried by all of the responsibilities that an academic has, all the things you're supposed to be doing. And you work 60 hours a week and you still don't get everything done.
Yeah.
Then there's reasons for that too, because it's part of the management strategy. So it just wasn't time to sort through these kinds of issues. But when I retired, I could sort through them. I could start to deal with them and reflect on them and contemplate and bring them up at times of meditation. I mean, and slowly some things emerged. And the mystical perspective here is, to me, is a very important, it's very important for me to integrate together the view that science has and the view that mysticism has, that these both have a piece of the reality, and I couldn't become unified within myself in a holistic way without combining these two things together.
And that's what brought us together, and why I'm thrilled to have you and to be able to do these talks, because I think that this will assist people who are interested in bridging that gap, crossing the aisle in that way, because a lot of our society is scientific. It is discontinuous. It is making a lot of assumptions. And in order to reach that fullest potential of science within itself, there is going to be a merging that must occur for it to reach its fullest potential. And looking at how individuals have been able to integrate this, to bring these two together, is a starting point. It's a way of trying to find a context for reference points that can be shared for people. And that's why I'm particularly excited to have these conversations, John, and honored to have you. And I'm sure the audience feels the same way as we move forward. And thinking about how this context and these reference points come in. If we were to think about your integration process of the scientific mind and the scientific procedures and your training with the metaphysical and the spiritual and the unity, we can call it unity. What have you learned? I know it's a tricky question. Talk about context, right, John?
Yeah, well, that's
So-
what I've learned uh, hasn't helped me get along with people any.
Okay, well, that's
Um,
okay. I'm very
um,
open, so I don't think you can throw any punches across Zoom anyways, so.
no, no, no. Well, and we're pretty good friends, so
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
we
okay.
can
We
be
could get some
pretty
feedback.
candid.
It's okay to ruffle
But
feathers every once in a while.
well, what I think I've learned a couple of really important things.
Okay?
One of them, and these are not in order of importance either. They're just going to be in order in which they come up. But
Okay.
I think a lot of arguments, a lot of conflict, a lot of violence, frustration, anger comes from these issues of reference points and context.
Mm-hmm.
And the simple task of seeking another's context.
Yeah.
I remember years ago reading a saying of one of the American Indians, Native American Indians, which was that don't judge anyone until you've walked for 2 weeks in their moccasins.
Ah,
All right.
yeah.
Which is a way of saying that find out others' context,
Yeah.
learn where they're coming from. I mean, I can talk about the same basic subject with two different people who have two different contexts, and I won't use any of the same words.
I know you're very gifted with that. Yeah, I do the same sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just it's natural because it is now for me because I've been doing this for over a dozen years, and it's helped enormously to have constructive conversations with people who feel really different about things than I do. And I have sometimes this somewhat awkward experience of being friends and having a good relationship with two different people who can't stand each other.
Ah,
And it's difficult. It's difficult for me because I feel that those two people who really have so much. I mean, I'm thinking of a specific example now, okay? But the two people I'm thinking of at this point are two people who have so much to gain from each other,
yeah. It's
enormous
typically,
amount to gain
yeah.
from
That's
each
typically
other.
how it would
If they
be.
came,
Yeah.
yeah, but they never will. They never will because they can't talk to each other without problems. And
Mhm.
both of them are respectful people in their own right. And so rather than yell and argue and all of that stuff, they just don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
That's the way they respect the other person is not to badmouth them. And neither of the people talk about the other person, at least when I've been around talking to them, they never talk about this other person in a derogatory way.
Yeah.
They're respectful people, but they can't benefit from the gifts that each one has for the other because they can't adopt the context of the other person. I
Yes.
mean, and so this is, to me, this is important to understand and treat conversations with the power that they really have. You know, biblically speaking, it's, you know, our mouth is a risky tool that we have, and that, you know, a word is like it's like a single match dropped into the dry debris of a forest, right? And that one word, like that match,
Yeah.
sets a conflagration in progress. that can destroy enormous amounts of, well, order, I should say. It turns a whole massive possibility of an ordered system into total disorder, heat,
Yeah.
right? Ash and heat. I mean, so it's a serious business having a conversation.
You're right.
And that's something I've learned about this. And what I've realized is that many of the guides that come through the spiritual or mystical or religious channels about how to get along with others and respect and such, it is really hinged on this unity perspective. At least that's became clear to me after I studied some of this, that having this perspective that doesn't take ownership of a certain turf and a certain perspective and a certain point of view, but is open to learning that this is key. And this unity perspective is the one that came to the forefront for me. Because it works in science too. It works in everything.
Yeah.
I realized that in my career as an interdisciplinary scientist, is that I was learning about this from the nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
Trying to work across the boundaries of the disciplines. And when the boundary of a discipline lines up with a geographical boundary in nature, and you're trying to work across this physical boundary with a disciplinary boundary at the same place, it's enormously challenging to do this. But nonetheless, it can be done. It's possible to do it.
I think unity, you think about unity and duality. You talk about duality to experience unity, unity to experience duality. They make it possible. Coming from a point of unity, it makes sense. When you're coming from a point of unity, you're not going to particularly choose one polarity or another, or one particular perspective or context or reference point over the other one. And it came to me very, very simply as, for every opinion, fact, belief, whatever it may be, context, reference point, there's an equally opposite one that will exist. Always.
That's what duality is.
Yeah, always.
Always.
And they're both just as valid.
There's only one way to top that, because there's one thing we have access to that is the unity itself, and that's love. Love doesn't have an opposite, at least for me. Love doesn't have an opposite. Love is unity.
Yeah, but we could say that these polarizations are, in fact, a product of unity and love, right?
Yeah, they're derived from that, because in essence, everything comes from love. Because that definition of love is talking about interaction. So if once you establish the duality and let them interact, then you have this balanced interaction that's occurring all the time. And that's the function of love, is to guide that. Right? And the problem, and it happens in the physical world. It always happens in the physical world. And all of our science descriptions are referenced to equilibrium or balance or whatever, conservation principles. These very fundamental things are built on that concept, that this balance, a balance like this, is crucial to understanding. I mean, an energy balance. We couldn't begin to deal with this thing we call energy without the concept of conservation of energy. I mean, the
Yeah.
reason it's such a powerful concept is no one has a clue how to relate two disparate things to each other other
Yeah.
than by this method.
I think,
It's got to sum to zero. I mean, and so this is part of science too. This
yeah.
notion that it starts at unity. I mean, I tend to just categorize it in the 7 dimensions of the intelligence of the heart.
Mhm.
Again, this is not something I thought of.
No.
This is something I read in a book, and the more I thought about it, the better I liked it. So
Yeah.
it's become part of my context. But those 7 dimensions, I mean, they start at unity, and then it's love,
Yeah.
and then it's life. I mean, and what's life? Life is love and motion.
Mhm.
So it's the evolution of these exchanges.
Yeah. So it's
And
interesting.
it's,
Yeah.
and has a direction.
Yeah. So would you say it's
So,
easier
so
to?
much comes together this way for me.
Yeah. Would you say it's easier to find unity with the heart than it is the mind?
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
So the initial,
Absolutely.
yeah, so the initial part of our conversation, and sometimes we start out intellectual, we ask these intellectual questions. And throughout our integration process or conversation that we have with the audience, we slowly transition into the heart to find
Yeah.
to find resolution.
Yeah.
So we start out in the mind, we ask these inquisitive questions, and then we go into the heart to find integration and unity. And we let go. We let go and surrender. Let all be as it is, with a healthy detachment, which would be, if we could apply a healthy detachment to the context or the reference point, know that each one that's presented to you is equally valid.
Yeah.
And once you grasp onto one and push another one away, you're splitting yourself already.
Mm-hmm.
You're already
Fragment.
producing a schism. So by
Yeah.
pushing someone else away, saying, I'm not part of that, you're putting a schism within yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then it creates pain and suffering and distance and separation. And you wonder why you are feeling the way you're feeling. Because you're not separate.
But it's interesting because in physics, there's this concept of particle wave duality.
Yes.
And we think about particles pretty concretely and generally assume that everybody thinks about the world as being particles put together, stuck together one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
But waves are equally valid way to describe it. And the interesting thing about a wave is all waves go to infinity. Right? And so they don't have a beginning and an end. They just are or they are not.
Yeah.
And it's in that sense, unity is a whole lot more adaptable construct for visualizing reality
Mm-hmm.
than the particles are. And these waves, these fields of waves, carry energy with them, right? And just like a moving particle is carrying energy with it as inertia, and it can do work. You get in the way of a car and you find out how much work that car can do on your body in a very short period of time. It transfers a whole lot of energy to you. Its kinetic energy becomes your kinetic energy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and this is just the way we do things in physics and in science. But the whole unity concept is equally applicable in science. But the reductionist creation of all these disciplines has fragmented it to the point of not being apparent anymore. If you're buried in one of these sub-disciplines somewhere,
Mm-hmm. So if we were to bring unity into context and reference points in a way that could facilitate effective exchange and communication, what would that look like? Are there any tidbits of wisdom that we can supply to our audience today as to how to integrate some of this unity into a context, into a reference point?
Well, I think that could best be done with some movies, with some
Movies,
videos. Yeah, some
videos.
visual things. For example,
Okay.
take an ant colony and watch an ant colony. Get a good videographer who can magnify the ant community and watch how it works and get inside of it and see what their dens look like. And then this would be a tremendous undertaking. Maybe it's even impossible, I don't know. But I've sat down and watched ants. We have a hummingbird feeder, and if the ant trap in the hummingbird feeder goes dry, the ants will find that sugar water, period. All right. The ants are down on the ground. The sugar water is up here at 5 feet.
Yeah.
Those ants, they will climb up this pole in a row, spaced about 1 ant size apart, right? And you'll see them, hundreds, thousands of them. They're marching up this pole and they go over and through the ant trap, right? And they get to the hummingbird feeder, and some of them drowned in this sugar water, right? They can't quite handle all of the sugar water, and other ones hang on the edge there and they get as much sugar water as they can get, and they go back, and I don't know what they do with it, but they disappear. So you've got these 2 rows, the ones that got the sugar water, and they're going down this rod, this rod that's staked into the ground and about 6 feet long. And there's another row of ants going up to get, right? I mean, and as soon as you put water into that ant trap, they're all gone. I mean, in 10 minutes, there's not an ant anywhere in sight. You look at these ants and watch the way they operate. I mean, some of them even farm. Some of these insects farm. Or then I don't remember if it's ants or other insects, but they'll farm fungi and use them for food or for some application within their nest. So these things are amazing, and if you watch them from a height, you realize that there's a lot of stratification here, just like our culture.
Mm-hmm.
Some people do this, some people do that, some ants do this, some ants
I know,
do
it's
that.
an amazing microcosm.
It is, it's absolutely amazing. And I think, a film produced that way to show how to view something from a unity perspective. To see all that's going on and then internalize that. And when you internalize that, suddenly your conversation changes. Now I have an advantage that I didn't know about.
Oh, what's that?
All of my life until maybe 10 years ago. Well, that's 8 or 10 years ago. And that is that, and people told me this, but I never believed it because it doesn't sound believable. It's that I'm an empath. So at some point, I finally started to believe it and realized that I pick up things from energy from other people that they assume is theirs, and they haven't said anything or exposed it, so nobody knows about it. But I do know about it. So a lot of times I can have a conversation with somebody and I know what not to say to them.
Or what to say to them.
or what to say to them.
Mhm.
Because, and I can't tell you how that happens. And I think,
yeah,
I think caring about people and loving all of the people I run into, at least as best as I'm able to. I'm not
yeah,
perfect at that, and I screw it up sometimes. But doing that somehow, I think, gives you access to some things you don't have when you're competing and judging and such. You shut off capacities that you have with those
yeah,
practices. And so a lot of times, I remember when I was at Penn State in meteorology in the 70s, that there were a couple of faculty members who I could tell from 30 feet or 40 feet away whether I should say good morning to them or not.
yeah,
And it's probably body language, it's probably the way they're walking, it's facial expressions, I don't know. No spring in their walk, or I don't know what it was that was doing that. But by paying attention to people and really and caring about people, you pick up all kinds of things.
yeah.
And you can start to use them to build positive relationships with people.
And to not take their energy on as your own,
No, right, don't.
which is a
Yeah,
critical point. Is to not, and everything is energy transference. And even as a young boy, being an empath, I didn't know that I was taking on other people's energies as my own.
mhm.
I didn't know that that was such a powerful thing, but it
It does.
was.
Yeah, it happens.
And when you realize, wait, I was taking on other people's energy as my own, accepting it as my own, and wondering why I was all upset,
Mhm.
why I was not comfortable. And so we managed to cover some serious ground, from context and reference points all the way to energy transference and observing the reality. And I'd like to just do a brief summary for the audience and some of the things that we had discussed. When it comes to a reference point and your context, whether coming from a place of unity is a way to meet people where they're at, it's a way for other people to meet you where you're at, it's a way to stay open, and it's a way to not necessarily attach or push away, but to be in that perspective, to observe your reality from a unity perspective, a balance that's continuous, that's closer in alignment with the truth. And this is a parts whole, where we see that, yeah, you can have a context, but that's a part of the whole. It's just a part. There's other parts too, just as important. There's the different roles that ants are playing in their colony. Everyone has a purpose. And if you take a larger perspective and understand each part has a purpose within the whole, even if you think it's contradictory or not, a lot of times it isn't if we really look at it from a unity perspective. And if we can internalize that, we can internalize that unity. We can observe from a reality of unity. So bring us connection. It will bring us peace. It will minimize combative conversations and the illusion of separation. And really dismantle a lot of the armor that we've put up in defense mechanisms that prevent us from finding the wholeness within. And I think John's done an excellent job outlining some of these fantastic avenues with regards to reference points and context. And I would ask the audience, it's a call to action. Observe yourself.
Mhm.
Just observe yourself and ask, where can I come from more of a place of unity? Where can I have a context that could bring me more happiness and fulfillment and wholeness in my life? Before reacting to a contradictory context or reference point, Can I find a purpose in that? Can I accept that as existing, as it is? And can I hold very loosely on to my context and reference points in a way that allows transference and communication? And observe yourself doing so. Try to observe yourself doing this in your daily life. I call this observational consciousness. And this lack of pushing away or attaching onto will create a flow within your being. And this could, I guess, could come down to be that more realistic state of continuity that John was talking about as well, to be applied to your life. A lot of times we think that our life is continuous and it's continuously evolving. A lot of times it could just be a single snapshot, like a movie where it appears to be continuous, but in fact, it's a bunch of freeze frames lined up to one another. So ask yourself, what is real? Is it the present moment? Is it the past, the future? What's real in the present moment? And what does real mean to you from a unity perspective? And can you apply that in your life when it comes to your context and your reference points and accept others? And remember that for every context and reference point, there's going to be a contradictory one, assumingly, without the unity perspective, but both are equally valid. And we can see that when we apply unity in our context and reference points. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, John?
I think you covered it pretty well. That could see one question coming up might be, where is the vantage point of unity? In other words,
Yes.
how do you do that?
Mm-hmm.
What is the process by which you do that? And that's a little tricky to explain. I think, at least for me, it is, because the best way I can lead into that without actually answering the question is that unity is basically infinity for us. We can't be there. We live in duality, and that's what we're stuck with. It's everything is its polar opposite here. But if the polar opposites are balanced, you approach something called unity. I mean, it's just like every action has a reaction, right? Newton's third law, right? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, what is that? That's saying that, you know, if one person pushes, another person gets pushed. What it means is that you constantly have complementary forces. This is part of that definition of a function of love. And so these polar opposites are balanced. And if they stay balanced, then the unity is preserved in the duality through the Trinity. And what's the Trinity? The Trinity is one polar position. The second is another polar position. Now you got two, that's the duality. But now you've got the relationship between the two. And that's the third leg of the Trinity. So it's really the balance that makes duality look like unity.
Yes.
So it means that it comes down to trying to live one's life, realizing that every positive thing you do and experience in your life, there's a equal and opposite negative thing somewhere, someplace in the reality. Yeah. It might be visible to you, it might not be visible to you. the balancing forces are not all visible to us.
Yeah, that's a critical point.
Yeah, and so, but it's going to be there.
Yes.
It's going to be there.
Mhm.
So every time I get some really positive thing that I was looking forward to or I wanted, there is a balance to that somewhere, right? And so our behavior is altered by this awareness that you have action and you have consequences, and they balance each other. And we tend to observe this in our physical reality.
Yeah.
That's the place it's most observable. So this unity is a little tricky to think about, because we
Yeah,
can't
but it's easy to
really,
feel. And so comes back to going to the heart.
the heart comes back to the heart.
You try to
And
figure it
how-
out with the mind. Good luck.
Well, and the next obvious question is, well, what does that mean?
It does.
And that's a whole nother topic.
And we
That's a
can,
whole nother show.
yeah, we can get on that. We can get on that. But we think about feeling with the intuitive aspect of the heart that includes the mind. So the mind, talk about heart-brain coherence is another perspective we can take.
Yeah.
But we are limited by our intellect, but our consciousness is limitless. Our cognition is limited, our consciousness is limitless. And that includes the intelligence of the heart being limitless. That's the access point. And we talk about intellect and intuition. By bridging those together, you'll find unity.
Mhm.
So you ask a question, you can't figure out the mind because you're limited, your cognition is limited. Go to the heart and ask it a question. Yeah, communicate there. Communicate there. Okay. Well, with that, I would like to thank the audience again for What's Up Doc number 10. The topic of context and reference points. I'd like to thank John again. It's always an honor to get together and have a wonderful conversation. I hope the audience is enjoying these topics. If there's any questions, feel free to reach out for those. Any suggestions on topics as we move forward, we're happy to receive those as well. And until we speak again, until we interact again beyond time and space, enjoy each and every eternal now moment. And I look forward to hearing miraculous, ingenious, amazing ways that you've integrated some of this unity into your context and your reference point. Till then, keep on keeping on, and we shall see you the next session. Have a great weekend.
Cheerio.
Cheerio.